Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. And you can support the channel on Subscribestar Locals and Buy Me a Coffee. I'm once again joined by Florian. This is also the end of my 2-week hiatus. Glad to have you back, Florian.
Hi, hello, how's it going?
Oh, great. So we wrapped up before my hiatus at the middle of June that we'd been looking at, specifically from the angle of biology, criticizing elements of the standard narrative about Darwinian evolution. But that leads us, of course, to broader. We end up keep pushing it back because there's these assumptions, right? And we keep running up against these assumptions that determine how data is interpreted. And I thought, okay, well, let's keep going with this, but I don't really think we need to go back to biology anytime soon, unless somebody has anything to talk about. But one of the things that you'll often hear is that, well, God, spirits, the soul, angels, demons, whatever, can't be proven empirically. And that's a claim you'll hear a lot of new atheists make. And even someone who's far more credible, like Bertrand Russell, who's clearly not a hack or a quack, he'll say the same thing. And, obviously, I have problems with that. And I think that there's certain assumptions that are at play here. So when we look at scientific observation, we can say that, like a naturalist would observe phenomena in nature, like animal behavior or plant growth or whatever, and then write about it and comment on it. Now, one assumption is that supernatural activity is invisible. That's only partly true, because we have different religious accounts or paranormal personal accounts, people experiencing visible things, right? Well, for example, a ghost, right? Oftentimes you can't see them. Like, think of a poltergeist, right? Something's there because objects are being thrown around, but you can't see it visually. But many people who claim to see ghosts or experience ghosts would claim to see something, but it's not material. It's some sort of manifestation. And of course, if you look at various religious texts, people claim to have seen gods or God or demons or angels, so on and so on. So I would first of all say that's not an assumption that is warranted, that these things, quote, can't be seen. But even if, for the sake of argument, we granted it to them, that okay, we can't see these things, that doesn't mean that we can't infer their presence or existence. A good example is when we did the Werner Gitt lecture, where we talked about the coding in the DNA. Well, who's the coder? And that whole lecture that we watched argued that, well, the coder was God. And we know that it's God because, one, he has to be super intelligent to code all the biological DNA that we have in our physical, Earth. He has to be super powerful, right, to be able to create all of this. And the very fact that we have information in the DNA code is proof of a coder. That is the proof. Now, to say that, okay, we have a DNA code, but I can't see God, means that that's not an explanation, is about as facile as saying that I found a book written by somebody who died 200 years ago, and because I can't see that person, he didn't write the book. That's not evidence he existed. Of course it's evidence he existed if it's a book that he wrote. So, you don't even have to actually directly see the producer of the effect to infer the effect. We also see this at a subatomic level, right? Modern day scientists will argue that we can infer things like quarks, gluons, and strings from the effects we observe, but we can't actually see them with the tools that we have. Well, that's just not fair. I cry foul there, because, okay, well, if you can't see a quark, a string, or a gluon, but you can infer its effect, I can't see God, but I can infer his effect. What's the difference? Well, the difference is fundamentally not a scientific one, because a quark and a gluon isn't going to hold you accountable at the end of days, but God will. But notice, when it comes to their own theories, they run up to unobservable phenomena. And they're like, oh, it's okay, we can measure the effects of these unobservable phenomena. Well, okay, I'm not going to argue against that on the face of it, but by that measure, you're going to have to say that you can measure God or other spiritual beings by the phenomena that they have. A good example would be like poltergeist activity. You don't see the thing, but there's stuff being thrown around, right? So that demands an explanation. And so, so I would say that the first thing is the just because you can't observe the cause of the effect does not mean that you can't infer that cause. And even with the materialistic sciences, we see that with subatomic particles. They can't see them, even through a microscope, they can't see them, but they infer that they exist. Well, okay, by the same token, we can infer not only God, but other spiritual beings exist. And I don't see why you would make that distinction unless you have an a priori philosophical commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think many good points. There's just one funny thing I realized lately. I was following some scientism channel, or like a guy called Professor Dave Explains. That's his channel name on YouTube, and he always attacks. Like he provided at first some nice videos in chemistry and physics for students to help them get the AP exam, and then he also ventured into criticizing, people that creationists or flat earther. He's a big debunker of those people, and he always attacks them by them not being credentialized. But he himself has a BS in chemistry, and that's it. Then he became a YouTuber. Now these people, that's like more power to them. But I'm just using an example to illustrate that the people basically they accuse everyone else of doing of not having certain qualification that they themselves not possess, which is another point of support to say that this modern scientism is just kind of like a cult, or kind of like when people talk about mainstream science shows this, this, and that, then they're basically just following a common narrative. It's not that they really their their statements themselves really. I think in general, to add on what you said, so yes, scientism scope is self-limiting, right? So if we define reality solely in terms of what can be directly measured or observed under laboratory conditions, then we preclude any other domain that could indirectly manifest or subjectively manifest. And I would also remind people that if it can't be seen or quantified, it doesn't exist. It's itself a non-empirical claim, right? Phenomena such as magnetism or electricity, they were once invisible too, until researchers devised tests for their effects, or the existence of germs, right? I think one American postulated the existence of germs. That was Wendell Holmes, Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. He published an influential essay urging physicians to wash their hands to prevent puerperal fever. I think that's the fever that mothers get after birth sometimes, that many women died of. But it was Semmelweis, a German surgeon, who enforced it as hospital policy and demonstrated its life-saving impact. And what he observed was just that surgeons would go from working on corpses, and then they would go on help deliver births or treat otherwise living people, and they carried like small particles with them. And Semmelweis and Holmes thought that those particles would carry diseases, and the prevailing notion of the time was to ridicule Semmelweis because the gentlemanly hands of a surgeon would not even be able to carry disease. This is a preposterous statement, and by my honor as a surgeon, I will not stand for that. And yeah, Semmelweis was ridiculed because nobody could see germs. But then, after a couple of years, when that hospital policy was introduced anyway, they started believing him, right? But also another example of things that were invisible and have later been proven to exist, right? That's another thing that mainstream science would debunk, this crazy Semmelweis, right? Um, and as you said, effects are the key. We don't know that magnetism really exists per se. We don't really understand what it is, but we see its effects, and then we can put into calculations, and then we can operate with it. But we're only looking at the effect, right? We're not looking at the force itself. We observe something beyond, like from a mirror, right? And a mirror of reality. We're not observing reality itself, right? And I don't know whether I mentioned that, but if it can't be seen or quantified, it doesn't exist, is itself a non-empirical claim, by the way, right? And I would say, as the last point, is, if you don't dismiss spiritual knowledge or spiritual observations, you can get towards an expanded epistemology, right? So you would integrate empirical rigor with subjective testimony and converging lines of evidence. If you treat spiritual phenomena not as a taboo, but as a frontier, and then you would invite innovative tools and protocols, right? This smart dismissal is really what I take offense with, and I think what most people that are not they're not part of mainstream science would also take offense with, right? It's this smart dismissal, like, we can't see it, we can't test it, it's probably not there, it's all bullshit. Instead of looking at, maybe there's something interesting, maybe we can have a deeper look into that. It's kind of like really tragic in a way, but some of these people, you can't reason with them because they just love being right? They just love being smart, and they lord their superiority over anyone, or these hicks or yokels that believe in Jesus and ghosts, right? It's very unfortunate. I like to believe it's unfortunate for the scientists. How would you call it? People believe in scientism. It's unfortunate for the scientism people themselves, because eventually they become relegated to the wayside when people actually look at phenomena that seem to be non-existent, and they find an explanation for that anyway, going into spiritual realms.
Yeah. So a good example of this mindset and why it's a problem is Anthony Flew. Now, he later became a deist. He wrote a book called There Is No God, and then he rewrote it saying there is a God. And he made that change of opinion based on the fine-tuning arguments, which we didn't get into, but the fine-tuning argument's a pretty well-known argument for the existence of God. But in his atheist stage, he had what was called the parable of the invisible gardener. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, two explorers came upon a clearing in the jungle. In the clearing were growing many flowers and many weeds. One explorer says, some gardener must tend this plot. The other disagrees. There is no gardener. So they pitched their tents and set a watch. No gardener is ever seen, but perhaps he is an invisible gardener. So they set up a barbed wire fence. They electrify it. They patrol with bloodhounds, for they remember how H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man could be both smelt and touched, though he could not be seen. But no shrieks ever suggested some intruder had received a shock. No movement of the wire ever betrayed an invisible climber. The bloodhounds never gave cry. Yet still the believer is not convinced. But there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks, a gardener who has no scent and makes no sound, a gardener who comes secretly to look after the garden which he loves. At the last, the skeptic despairs, but what remains of your original assertion? Just how does what you call an invisible, intangible, eternally elusive gardener differ from an imaginary gardener, or even no gardener at all? And see, this is where it gets really facile, right? Because by definition, spiritual, because this is supposed to be an argument against God, really. By definition, spiritual objects are not objects of sense primarily. They may manifest to sense, and they may influence the physical world around them, but none of those methods are going to catch a spiritual being. Why would you think that it would? Because by definition, a spiritual being has no mass. And since it doesn't have mass, well, in fact, according to modern physics, sometimes light doesn't even have mass. So photons, I mean. So, okay, how is that nothing then, right? I mean, if you're going to play that game. But the other thing is the idea that a spiritual object or being could be detected that way is just not, it's not properly understanding what a spiritual being is. And in an earlier video, I already demonstrated how information itself is non-material because it's non-rivalrous and non-exclusive. So if you and I, Florian, were to eat the same cheeseburger, that might pose a problem. But if you and I both contemplated the number one, there's no problem. I don't prevent you from doing it, and you don't prevent me, and the supply of one doesn't go down. Okay, it's still there, and you can use that concept of oneness in arithmetic and geometry to build structures. So I would argue that one way in which immaterial things can be interacted with and engaged with is through the intellect, right? Now, you might say that's not necessarily an empirical process, and it isn't. But the thing is, though, you can, and then that's mathematics, it's a priori. And then when you deal with that, you can then shape the world around you. It's not imagination. You're not imagining the world changing around you. It really is, because you've applied these higher order principles to the world around you. But then, second of all, if we look at the definition of what empiricism is, which is, well, all knowledge is derived from sense experience. I don't believe that. I'm not going to give another reasons why at the moment for here, but I'm going to argue, why would we assume spiritual objects cannot be perceived through the senses? People say they see ghosts. Okay, well, that's ocular stimulation of some kind, right? And then people say that sometimes, usually with regards to demonic apparitions, they smell sulfur, but there's no obvious source. So again, you have to make certain assumptions about supernatural or spiritual beings or things to say that they can't manifest sensory data. Why would you say that? Like, I don't know why you would have that as an assumption, that just because I mean, look, I can't see the wind, but I can feel its effect on my face, right? And as you said, Florian, we couldn't see electricity at one point, but we could feel it if we got struck by lightning. So just because I can't see a thing doesn't mean it can't stimulate some other sense, like, the skin or the nose, right, or even sight. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions that are baked in that are just not proven. They're not even demonstrated.
I mean, these things, which gets us back to the point about effects. You don't know. Yeah, you will feel electricity when you're struck by lightning, but magnetism, for example, there's almost no way to feel it unless you have a magnet, or, as we now know, a moving magnet creates an electromagnetic field, and the other way around, right? So if you put a magnet through a metal wire, it will induce a current through that wire, and if you have a current in that wire, then it can move a magnet through it, or stop it. But for example, there's always this interesting question in how birds that migrate to Africa in winter and come back, how do they know where to go, right? And there was always this idea, and I don't know, I should know, but I don't know uh, whether that has panned out, but there was this idea that the cells of some of these birds have magnetosomes, like small bodies that can be magnetized, and then they can actually follow the magnetic lines of the Earth. That is a plausible explanation, and without knowing magnetism, you would think this doesn't exist, right? You can only know it when you actually have the tools to, excuse me, to experience it, right? So once again, this the rejection of spiritual phenomena, just because you don't have the apparatus to measure it, is just it's not believable. And moreover, we get so many impressions from the outside world all of the time, and we would be just overwhelmed if we get them all, if we all consciously experience all the effects we get from the outside. So our brain filters out about 90% of what we perceive, and so that goes into our subconscious. That's why we know how to operate a car once we have gotten the hang of it, right? That the brain just compartmentalizes with this new information at one point. Once we can drive a car, then the brain automates it, and those impressions we don't get anymore. So there's a lot of subconscious that is never tapped. We never learn about it because our brain just puts it away. So, and the apparatus we build are based also on what we feel and what we can see in a way, right? So even if we don't go into the spiritual realm, we can already go into a into a much bigger realm that would, in theory, be scientifically, that would, in theory, be able to empirically show. But we don't know it. We're blissfully unaware of it because it's filed away in our subconscious. And then I'm sure there's more things that even our subconscious doesn't know. Like a very simple example is some butterflies. They can see ultraviolet light. We can't. So they can see extra patterns on some of the flowers. I don't know whether that would be neat to have that capability. We don't. but that means there's many other phenomena out there which wouldn't even come to our mind to look at, right? We only know that butterflies can perceive ultraviolet light because we know ultraviolet light exists, and we can then do some conclusions from our observations. But how many other things are there? How many other effects are there that we're just completely unaware of, right? And that we just dismiss. But we could use, if we accept the spiritual as I said before, as like some new epistemological frontier, we can basically be more open and maybe explaining some other phenomena that were previously not easy to explain.
Well, yeah, and so the other thing to look at here too is I'm not necessarily saying this is the case, but it has been proposed that we could view spiritual phenomena as occurring in a higher dimension. So that would explain why that phenomena can affect us in ways that we cannot easily perceive. So let's use an example, right? The hypothetical geometric object, the tesseract, its shadow in our 3 dimensions would look like a cube, but it's not a cube. It is a shadow of a higher dimensional object. Now, no one's found a tesseract, but it's a speculative 4th dimensional object. Now, okay, well, what if again spiritual phenomena occurred in some higher dimension? And furthermore, from our vantage point, how could we tell the difference between a cube and the shadow of a tesseract? Because they would look the same, but the cube's existence would not exist in the 4th dimension. Only the tesseract would. So again, that's weird, right? It's weird, but we can think like that, and we can see how you could have effects that from a higher dimension would be much more difficult to observe. So, if, using this dimensional argument, let's say you were some life form living in 2 dimensions. Could you really appreciate 3-dimensional physics? That'd be really hard for you to appreciate because your entire existence is confined by the 2 dimensions, right? So some sort of like Nintendo game character, right? Oh, you're 2 dimensions. How do you understand all this other stuff? Well, I mean, I'm not saying you couldn't, but it'd be very hard. Just like for our level, it would be very hard. And then the other thing too is if we look at, say, there's a kind of unfalsifiability problem that these people have as well, because they're always going to come up with some excuse. So you might, let's say you were in a room where there was poltergeist activity. They would just say, well, I don't have an explanation. Well, you can't be in a room seeing things flying around without any obvious motive force and then just smugly put your thumb in your pant pockets and say, hey, I have no explanation. You need to have something. Or, imagine if you were, they were getting into a time machine and see Jesus turn loaves, and fishes and multiply them. They would say, well, they could actually see the miracle and just not accept it. That's the kind of people they are, right? They're not good actors because they could literally see the thing happen and then say, no, it didn't happen. It didn't. And we can infer this from other things. So we can see we know from Shannon that you have to have a sender to have information in a, intelligible language, which we have in DNA. Okay, so by science, we have to have a sender for the information in DNA. And they just say, no, we don't. And it's like, well, that is the indirect proof of this higher dimensional intelligence, let's call it. Whereas, I mean, that's just as good as the inferences you have for quarks and gluons, which you admit you can't see. So part of it too is, so let me put it this way. What I'm getting at is, how could one determine from the effect of some observable phenomena that its cause was spiritual of some kind? And the test that I would say is, if you look at this effect and you look at all the physical causes at work behind this effect, and you still have not completely explained the effect, you probably are getting close to an effect that was caused by some supernatural force or agent. So what would you say to that, Florian?
Yeah, and as a first approximation, that's probably accurate. It's difficult to provide a testable hypothesis based on something that you only see, right? That you can't really interact with, and you would still have to figure out what triggers the effect, or there's anything that triggers the effect, and then you could try to reproduce that. But that's the one thing that's always difficult to prove with spiritual parts, that it's difficult to design an experiment because it doesn't adhere to any pattern. If you wanna predict gluons and quarks, you can design experiments because you can assume that that they behave similar to other particles, and then you can basically extend them as part of a mathematical equation, right? And then you can design a large particle accelerator and design experiment to make them visible. But if there's no recognizable pattern, then you're kind of in a dilemma because you don't know what to do to reproduce the effect. So the effect may be reproducible, but it may not be easy for you to figure out how, which doesn't mean that you should dismiss it. The tendency is then to look for pattern that fit better, right? And then you kind of squeeze the observation into some predictable pattern and say, okay, but we can't show these, we can't reproduce these effects with our technology, and so it's maybe not real. No, maybe you haven't found the way. Maybe you haven't found good experiment to show that they are real, and this requires more observation and maybe a more open mind. But that's indeed a bit of a dilemma.
So yeah, there's a few things here. Let's first state what there's two basic ways that empirical science gains knowledge. One is just what we call naturalism, observing phenomena in nature. Now, you can't control that phenomena, but you're observing it and just collecting information. And then the second one is what you said, laboratory settings, all the rigid controls and experiments. At the stage that I'm talking about, we can't do experiments yet, at least in most cases. But I'm saying we probably could do something akin to naturalism, where if we use that formula that I came up with, once you look at all the material inputs to this event and you still don't have a full explanation for what you just saw, you have a good reason to believe that you might be observing some kind of spiritual phenomena. Now, that would be more akin to naturalism, where you just observe a phenomena happening. The other thing is, a lot of these spiritual agents are going to be persons, in which case you have a whole thing. It's not like observing some wildlife or flora, right? You're actually dealing with an intelligence. Now, what can we look at? Well, number one, okay, let's look at the most famous one everybody talks about, right? Demonic possession. One way that people who engage, investigate demonic possession or look at exorcisms would say, does the person know a language that they did not previously know and could not know? Now, if that's an open and shut case, I think. I mean, how does somebody know a language that they have no right knowing, right, with the speaking voice? Well, it can't be them because they didn't know the language before. That would be okay, right? You look at you. So what do we see? We see the person talking in a voice that may or may not be his or her own, in a language that they did not know before. Okay, well, explain where that language knowledge came from, because it wasn't there before. That would pass the test if you could find an actual a confirmed case of demonic possession like that. Another thing that will pass that test are accounts of people that were declared brain dead. Remember, brain dead, so they should have no brain functions according to the atheist. But then they can talk about seeing what was going on in the medical room that nobody else talked about or knew. They were like some sort of like their spirit was still there, and their body might have actually still been alive. They were just declared brain dead, right? So, and then they get resuscitated, and it's like, okay, even if they weren't dead, how did they see all that? Well, they didn't see it. They didn't perceive it through their human reasoning powers because they were brain dead. That's another example, right? And then those are the two main ones that I'll work with here, because the third one is, if we look at the definition within, material ESP, basically. The idea of telekinesis is moving a physical object with your mind. Well, if we assume minds are not material, and I've gone on before on my channel to describe why I think you should, everybody's latently telekinetic because anything we do is determined by our mind giving the body the signal to do it. So, okay, that's also a non-material causal factor to doing what we do. Now that can be interfered with if you drug people or somehow disrupt their nervous system, then their body won't respond to what they're thinking. But that's because it's almost like working through a medium to do this, and the medium is the physical human body. But all three of these examples, I think, are examples of the law this rule that I'm talking about. We look at the physical phenomena, and there's something that it cannot be captured by merely physical descriptions, and that I think is evidence of supernatural realities and operations, both of a personal and an impersonal level, using that formula that I came up with.
Yeah, well, I think you described several points of how the church, how the Catholic Church at least, describes supernatural phenomena or demonic possession or something like that. I think it's called Xenoglossy. If you speak foreign or ancient languages that you couldn't possibly know before, that you know about hidden things or secrets that you would normally not be knowledgeable about. And I think superhuman strength is another part. Like if you can resist physical restraint beyond your age or health, that is how the church determines demonic possession. And probably miracles are in a similar way. There's also aversion to the sacred, right? Involuntary recoil from holy water or crucifixes or sacred rites. But yeah, that's a good point. I mean, somebody speaks a language they don't know before. Yeah, that's a good point that there may be something supernatural going on. Now, I know that when I was with my family in Christmas, there was some curious action taking place in the kitchen of my aunt. She had a large basket, there's 3 baskets hanging down, where she had like fruit and snacks and stuff like that. And several times, like over the past days, and I think that evening as well, like a bag of chips fell out. And it was like extremely unexplainable how that bag of chips would fall out. Now, it could have a very natural explanation, but how would you reproduce that? It's difficult to reproduce, right? And that's non-personal, right? So there wouldn't be any ancient language be spoken or anything like that. But it's fascinating to think about how you would show whether that's a huge supernatural phenomenon going on or not.
Yes. No, but what about the example I gave of the near-death experience where the guy's brain dead, but then is able to then, after being resuscitated, describe all these things going on in the room?
Yeah, there's something going on there's still something that we pick up from our environment that doesn't somehow involve our eyes. That's the only explanation, right? Because otherwise, I think it's very specific also the information they give. Now, it's possible that the subconscious makes a very, very accurate snapshot of things that go on in the room. But then also, I think they also notice if somebody moves something around, right? So something that happens after they are declared brain dead, so they can still describe that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The other thing too is in both the case of naturalism and laboratory work, scientific empiricism is based on observation. In this case, observation with the eyes. But with spiritual realities, we might say on the one hand, so I mentioned this before, if we envision, let's just call it a higher dimension, for lack of a better word, where human minds, God, intermediate intelligences, angels, demons, whatever exist in, there's some sort of region where they exist. And I argue that, well, there's probably going to be forces that are non-personal, like on Earth, wind, tides, flowing water, but then also the intelligent agents acting. So something like telekinesis might be a force that's just there, but then the daimon that gave Socrates his knowledge would be an intelligence that lives there, and those are two different things. But the point is, mystics and religious devotees say that you perceive spiritual realities directly. You and in more Eastern traditions, they'll call it the third eye, right? So it could be that the kind of the quote observation would one be the material effect that we're seeing, and we've already talked about that. But a second layer of observation might be what we call direct apprehension. And direct apprehension would be through this higher numinous quality that the human mind has, that it just, for example, I talked about qualia. You cannot be mistaken that you're in pain. You might be mistaken as to why you're in pain, but that you are in pain, you cannot be mistaken about, because it is an immediate, it's an unmediated experience that you have. Yeah. And of course, mysticism, the mystics claim that they can acquire an unmediated experience with God or other spiritual phenomena. If such a thing could be done, that might be a kind of spiritual empiricism, whereby your mind, your soul, your spirit has these immediate impressions with other spiritual entities and realities. And that would be the equivalent of observing lions on the Serengeti. Mm-hmm. Now, no one's saying that would be easy to do, but that's how we would want to, if we want to say that empiricism is compatible, because the point that I'm trying to argue here is that empiricism is compatible with spiritual realities, and that you could empirically discern spiritual cause and effect with empirical techniques. The first technique would be observing the physical effect around you, and then determining that once you've analyzed and quantified everything in that sequence of events, there are some things that define material reality or material description. You've like again, somebody learning a language that they didn't know before, right? That would be a good example of demonic possession, of what I'm talking about. But then you could also, quote, observe these things directly in an unmediated sense through a mystical experience, where for whatever reason you remove the sensory physical barriers through maybe meditation or prayer that would allow you to directly apprehend these spiritual realities. And that would be a kind of observation, but not with the sense of sight, but what we might call, second sight or the third eye or something like that. That would be a second order empiricism, from which you could experience and then discuss spiritual realities.
Yeah. Yeah, so you would think it goes via different dimensions.
For lack of a better word at this point, I mean, there's certainly it might be something even totally different than that, but given the edges. So if we look at like science under its current materialist paradigm, okay, there are all sorts of data points that just get thrown out a priori because the models can't accept them. A good example of someone who collects all of these data points that got thrown out was the early 20th century investigator of all weird and strange, Charles Fort, and his concept of Fortism, where he would collect all of this weird data, not even necessarily paranormal. Like, for example, ball lightning was one of the things he discussed in the early 20th century before science had accepted its reality. But he would include paranormal stuff too. He's like, well, look, we just can't toss out all these data points. We still have to look at them and figure out what they entail. And when we get these hard cases like demonic possession, or somebody who's been declared brain dead, or poltergeist or telekinesis or something, then you have to ask, okay, well, what are we bumping up against? What's above? We're like the fish in the water. We can't get out of it to breathe the air. We're just bumping up against the ceiling of some higher phenomena that still affects us. So, for lack of a better word, let's call it a higher dimension. It might be something else entirely, but from, we're at the fish underwater looking up, and it still has qualities that we can sort of kind of treat as a dimension, but also things that we can't, like the fact that a lot of these concepts like information are non-rivalrous. So yeah, it's for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Then these data points still exist, right?
Right. And what we're doing is we're putting them back into the model. We're like accepting them as real observed phenomena that's been recorded. And we're like, well, how do we account for this? Like what would account for this? And I think what has to be, any honest person is going to have to say that there is another aspect to reality which transcends the three dimensions we live in. You might want to call that a higher dimension. You might want to call that something else. But we can see it, we can bump into it.
Then AI should help us put these things together, because AI should be very neutral towards any dimension or any other part of reality that we haven't yet seen. But if it can be put together, then AI might be a way to put it together.
Well, it would certainly help. One of the things that AI is very good at is collecting data. I mean, AI is great at that, and so that's one thing you can do. And so what I'm saying is that even if we view empiricism of narrowly defined as this observation of phenomena as the bedrock of science, I don't see any reason why observation. Because what ends up happening is, if you read like the skeptics, like the OG skeptics, like Gibbon and Hume and others, they're like, well, no, there isn't the testimony of miracles that you'll get, especially like in the Bible. Why don't philosophers say they saw miracles? Why don't we see miracles in like a large metropolitan area like Rome, where nobody can doubt it? The problem is they just keep shifting the goalposts, though, because there are people that claim to have seen supernatural phenomena all sorts of places, right? And from what they would consider credible, reputable sources, but they just shift the goalpost and are like, nah, not really. We didn't see it after all, guys, right? And so that's the problem, right? And again, I don't see why, if somebody saw an apparition, whatever you want to call that thing, whether it's a human soul or something else, if they saw it and it does represent some unexplained phenomena from this higher dimension, how can you say that they didn't see it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you want to dismiss it, you can find 10,000 excuses of why people haven't really seen what they have seen, right? They probably just had their mind was tired, so they saw some vision, but it was totally not real, or they were really daydreaming or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, it could be that not everyone is able not everyone is able to see these phenomena, but some people are, right? There could be one other simple explanation for why not everyone sees these phenomena.
Well, let's put it this way, right? There's the old adage, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Now, when it comes to, if you were blind and you could not see, then if somebody who had eyes said they saw something, but you couldn't verify it because you can't see it, you could play the skeptic and come up with all sorts of reasons why they didn't see what they saw, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the blind man here is a deviation from the norm, right? So he can't, and I would argue that the skeptic or the atheist is like the blind man. He's a deviation from the norm, because throughout all of human history, everybody admits we can experience and see these phenomena. Now, some people, like priests or sages or saints or medicine men or whatever, are better able to experience it due to natural aptitude or training and alignment. But the idea that nobody can do this is a very recent innovation, on the a part of Western thought, right? And so I would argue that these guys are like the blind man that's saying, well, I can't see, the tree that you're pointing at. Well, yeah, of course, because you're blind.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and you could argue that in modern society, propaganda is making us willfully blind, right? It's basically making us blind by dismissing and ridiculing certain phenomena. If you take the people that are visionaries, and you can either honor them as someone who is able to see at the basically at the forefront at the frontier of experiencing something new, right? Or you could also ridicule them and say, "Oh, those are just some idiots, probably mentally disturbed. Don't listen to them." Then you'd make an entire society blind, right? And for whatever reason, you get the impression, especially with the upcoming of the novel Atheists and so on, there was some efforts to really extinguish people who had different points of view, right? So basically, we ridicule these because everything like, oh my God, I fucking love science, but if somebody has really an interesting observation, it gets just dismissed, right? And and that's very unfortunate, but I think these things are also changing.
I think you're right. I think they are changing. But one of the things that has sort of led me to come at it in this way is, for a couple of decades now, I've had a real fascination with what we might call like the paranormal, high strangeness, weird stuff. A lot of these stories you'll see floating on the internet can be explained away as fabrications or misidentifications. But there's always a few cases of each of these different phenomena that are very, very hard to just say didn't happen. And it really forces you to think. It's like, well, if you're just going to default and say that, say, like maybe like 10 to 15% are these like core, really hard to argue with cases. Well, people were there, people wrote about it, people were interviewed, people saw it. How do you explain that? To just say that they all, wish fulfillment or hallucinated or whatever, it just doesn't see the explanation of the cause doesn't fit the effect. Right? The effects can often be quite varied in these different paranormal stories. And it's like, okay, I'll give you a good example. So in 1934 in Spain, in the city of Zaragoza, there was what was called the Zaragoza Goblin. So for about a year, there was this disembodied voice coming out of I think it was a cooking stove in this apartment building. I mean, the police were called. They did a full search of the building. The power was cut to the building because people thought, well, maybe it's like a recorder. And there was one person who was suspected to have been a ventriloquist who was throwing her voice, but the voice was still heard even when she wasn't in the room physically. That's really weird. We have newspaper reports, police reports. This is not just something that happened in a corner, and it's not really easy to explain. I don't think we could just wave our hands and say it's gone. I mean, if you have police reports of policemen who were there and heard it, and then newspaper reports saying that, even the city government got involved, I think we have to look at this and say, wow, something really weird's going on that we can't explain with our normal scientific understanding. And that's just one example. And so when you have an explanation for a effect, for something, it has to be appropriate to the effect. So, right, if you say that, say somebody died of trauma from a projectile, okay. If and you're not going to say it's a pebble, you're going to say it's probably a bullet. If you don't know any better, and the pebble is just not a lethal enough projectile to do the thing, right? So you're not going to use that as an explanation because it's not sufficient to explain the effect. And to just hand wave and say it's hallucinations or gullibility, in the cases that are really hard to, deny or sweep away under the rug, that's just not a sufficient explanation in my mind.
Well, one thing that people are trying now is to use AI to talk to animals, right? So basically, if you figure out the patterns of animal languages, like think about dolphins or whales, for example, then you may be able to figure out some of what they are saying actually and translate them into human language in a way. And I'm just thinking that maybe that way, so since some animals do have a certain an additional sense, right? For example, if there's a natural disaster coming up, animals are often sensing that something is about to happen before humans do. So it may well be that if we learn to communicate with animals via AI, that will also reveal some interesting new phenomena that we haven't experienced before, but we can now experience when we manage to understand animals' language. That could be something very exciting. and maybe something that people are not thinking about when they think about we just want to understand how animals communicate and what they really mean. So that may be something interesting for the future.
Well, the other thing that's interesting too is prior to the scientific age, it was generally considered that there was a lot of nonverbal communication between humans and animals. Think of like a man and his horse, for example, or a man and his dog. That's something that we don't. That's not as easily quantifiable in a scientific sense. But there are ways to communicate nonverbally to animals in ways that are more than just procedural training. But the point that I'm getting at though is that I think we have enough data collected over the last 200 years that doesn't fit neatly. I mean, scientific data that doesn't fit neatly into this materialist paradigm, this materialist empiricist paradigm. And to say that, if you can't see the cause of an effect, it's not real, is ludicrous. Quarks and gluons can't see those, but they infer they exist from the data they collect. Okay, well, I can infer paranormal realities based on the data I collect, like a demon possession, because some kid just started talking in Aramaic, right? I mean, why can't I do that? There's no reason why I can't. It's just some mental block that these people have. The other thing is, I gave a test for how you could observe a physical phenomena that is in part or in whole caused by a supernatural phenomena, i.e., if you describe it, and even though you've looked at all the physical parts and described them all, you still haven't described the phenomena. That, in my mind, indicates that there's something more than just something really physical involved in that process.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, if we view direct perception through your third eye or whatever as a kind of spiritual empiricism, like certain mystics, sages, holy men can do, then yeah, that's a possibility for a kind of, quote, spiritual science. And then the fourth point is, in the same way that to be a scientist, it takes a lot of training in a university setting to develop the skills in order to be an actual scientist, it's going to take a lot of specific training to be a kind of spiritual scientist, right? So historically, natural philosophy preceded empirical science, and it was rather amateurish. I think what we've seen up to this point is a parallel, rather amateurish. I mean, we have had, in different societies, whether they're, medicine men, witch doctors, priests, sages, or gurus, they've been trained to be able to engage with this spiritual reality. And one of the reasons why you don't have that many of them is because in the past, most people still had to work with their hands to provide food, clothes, and shelter. So only a tiny few could be the elite spiritual adepts. But it was amateurish, just like the natural philosophy prior to the scientific revolution. But that's not to say that if you built a parallel education structure to train up people like this, you couldn't train, quote, spiritual scientists who are attuned to these principles and could then engage with them in a systematic, rational way.
True. Yeah. So basically, training people to be receptive to what we would call spiritual phenomena or supernatural phenomena.
Exactly, because right now, as you pointed out, our society does the exact opposite, right? It discourages that. It says you're crazy. It doesn't give you any incentive to do that, right? So the Middle Ages was totally opposite, right? There was every incentive to join the monastery and become a monk or a nun, and then develop these potentials. And there was an organization, the Catholic Church, that paid for the education and housing and clothing of these people in a way that we don't have today. I mean, they're still the Catholic Church, but you know what I mean? It's not like modern day universities where you have the state putting all this money into these projects. And so I'm saying that even if we define empiricism as something perceived through the senses, usually, but not always the eyes, that doesn't mean that supernatural realities cannot also be perceived through the senses. So, for example, hearing, when that person speaks in a language I didn't know before. Well, I just heard something, right? Or the disembodied voice of the Zaragoza goblin, if we want to argue that wasn't ventriloquism or somebody hiding in the walls. That was proposed, but no evidence was found that was the case. So yeah, there's a lot of different things here, but that's sort of what I wanted to end with. Is there anything that you want to like comment on to tie this all up, Florian, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I think if anything, then the introduction of artificial intelligence into science and into actually designing experiment, analyzing observations, and so on will reveal some new interesting parts. In a way, when people started to see that certain diseases could have a genetical background, they found several diseases that had just like one gene that was mutated and was causing an entire disease, like phenylketonuria. Basically, that's one enzyme that's broken, and so the organism can't metabolize certain amino acids, which leads to mental retardation of the children who unfortunately have that. But people could just see, okay, there's one mutation, and so if that's diagnosed right after birth, then you get a certain diet and everything is fine. Because if you survive that past 1 year, then you're completely normal. But most diseases aren't like that. They are not. You don't have like one mutation. You have a conglomerate of mutation. Some are milder, some are stronger. Like autism, for example, is one example for that. Multiple sclerosis is another example for that, and many others. Yet anything else in science is still seen from this like we want to see like one effect, one cause for our one effect that we observe, and that's also, I would say, that is a mistaken assumption. But since we can analyze DNA on the whole genome level, we can actually make much better informed decisions on what causes certain diseases. But I'm not sure whether you can do it in other other scientific disciplines like physics in the same way, right? So if we build our paradigm, there must be like one cause for one effect. We're already on the wrong track, and I'm sure that the introduction of artificial intelligence will take us away a little bit from that very reductionist view. It has served us well in many cases, but it also leads us to overlook some phenomena that we may find much easier to understand otherwise.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Florian. It's always a pleasure having you on. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast signing off.
Thanks for having me. Take care.